Hello everyone, my name is Khushbu Agrawal. This presentation is part of series of videos for Protecting Elections project for International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Fraud and corruption are one of the major drivers for electoral malpractice. While corruption takes a number of different forms, funding of political parties and election campaigns, commonly known as political finance, is one of the most widely exploited entry points for narrowed private interest to exert influence over politics and political processes. In order to build resilience of the electoral cycle against the influence of moneyed interests and ultimately against many types of electoral malpractice, it is important to ensure that robust political finance regulatory systems are in place. In this brief lecture, I will try to outline why political finance matters for democracy. Second, I will say a few things about some of the most pressing challenges that democracies have right now in terms of political finance matters. Finally, I will devote some time to what we can do about these challenges, how regulation of political finance can support good governance. In some respects, political finance is unfairly maligned. Almost everywhere, the influence of money is blamed for the failures and shortcomings of politicians and political processes. However, we must understand that money is a very normal part of the workings of a democratic system. It enables political participation and representation. It is nonetheless clear that money is capable of inflicting significant distortions in the democratic processes if not managed and regulated aptly. These are not new discussions. Anxieties about the role of money in politics are very old. In fact, they have been amply discussed for over 1 century in some democracies. It was in 1932 that James Kerr Pollock began his classic study on the financing of election campaigns with a warning. Relationship between money and politics has become one of the greatest problems of democratic government. Such an assertion, as well as his call to public opinion to understand that a healthy political life is not possible as long as the use of money remains uncontrolled, are truer today than in Pollock's own time. These early arguments have actually led to a proliferation of regulatory efforts that have gradually become a standard feature of democratic systems all over the world. In fact, over the last few decades, almost all democracies, as demonstrated by International IDEA's Political Finance Database, have instituted some sorts of political finance regulations in their countries. These regulations have come in the forms of limiting sources of funding, placing spending caps, requiring parties to be more transparent, imposing sanctions for political finance infractions, among others. The need for political finance regulation and transparency is also very well recognized in the context of anti-corruption efforts globally, such as in the case of United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the OECD recommendation on public integrity. While comprehensive, strict, and modern standards and regulations should be instituted, they are not an end to the maladies of money in politics. The truth is that, regardless of their lofty intentions, most of these regulatory efforts have been severely undermined in practice. In fact, one of the key problems in the modern-day political finance regime is the lack of effective enforcement of many of these legal controls that political systems have introduced in the past few decades. The failure to enforce not only deprives of meaning the efforts to legislate this area, but is actually one of the causes of the widespread cynicism that pervades discussions about the role of money in politics. Often, this failure is designed into the reforms that are enacted, either because of poor drafting of the norms, absence of robust sanctions, or the reluctance to endow the enforcing agencies with the right prerogatives or the resources. The plain truth is that it is only in a handful of countries that we know where the money is coming from and where it is being spent. In most countries, political finance continues to be a black box. All of this bestows the need for reform of political finance frameworks with a sense of great urgency. The problem is that it is incredibly difficult business. In fact, there is not a single democracy, whether it is rich, poor, consolidated, or not so advanced, has managed to conclusively solve the thorny issues posed by the role of money in politics. This truly is a global challenge for democracy, but complacency we must not accept. If there is one thing we know, is that there are no universal solutions to political finance challenges. The priorities and limits of political finance reforms are strongly context dependent. In some countries, issues connected to electoral fairness take precedence, whereas in other countries, the problems over transparency are the priority. Moreover, even in the same country, political finance priorities may change over time because of the scandals they have experienced or as the byproducts of reforms and other aspects of the political system. Disseminating good practice in the field of political finance is important, but even more important is to examine critically the policy options and match them with the political context in which they are to be implemented and the real problems that they are meant to solve. Here are a few assertions that we can make which have some tentative empirical backing. The list of these measures are wide, but some of those that have worked in most countries will be outlined. First is greater control over private funding, which can be done through bans on certain sources of funding, such as donations from anonymous sources, donations from foreign sources, from corporations, trade unions, non-governmental organizations, etc. A public subsidy system to ensure fairness for parties and candidates, to adequate funding to finance their regular day-to-day operations and electoral campaigns. A system, moreover, that provides incentives for compliance with other political finance controls. Establishing mechanisms of accountability, transparency, and disclosure of financial management of parties and candidates through measures such as establishing the obligation of political parties and candidates to report their income to the electoral authority, including in-kind contributions. Legally requiring the media to disclose rates and discounted rates that have been provided to political parties and candidates. Expressly granting the electoral authority the legal power to audit financial statements of parties and candidates. Explicitly establishing the public nature of campaign finance information and accordingly creating mechanisms by which the press and the public can have access to those financial statements. Publicizing the list of main sources of income of every party and candidate and the findings of the audit reports issued by the electoral authority. We could also establish a graduated system of sanctions for political parties and responsible officers in the event of any violations of the rules in force. Sanctions should always be in proportion to the crimes committed, and they can include withholding of state subsidies, establishing fines and prison sentences for the responsible officers and authorities of political parties, dissolution of party and removal from office of officials elected by popular vote as punishment for repeated and exceptionally serious violations. When designing these political finance regulatory systems, there are a few things to consider. First, the issue of money in politics is bigger than political finance. The use of money to fund parties and electoral campaigns is one of the several channels by which economic resources can influence politics. If political finance rules are to be effective in protecting democratic institutions, their connections to other norms that lie in the periphery of political finance must be understood. Effective regulation of campaign finance should be part of an ecosystem of integrity-enhancing rules, which also includes norms against conflict of interest, public procurement, asset declaration, rules regarding lobbying activities, reforms to banking and secrecy rules, among others. Second, countries should aim to achieve whole-of-society engagement on transparency, accountability, and anti-corruption efforts. Within government, this means developing better mechanisms for interagency coordination and collaboration. Beyond government, this means working closely with civil society, independent media, and the private sector. Finally, whichever reforms are adopted, the most crucial element is that they be backed by resources required for strict implementation, the willingness to review them when their inevitable shortcomings crop up, and a realistic understanding that no campaign finance system, no matter how robust and sophisticated, is capable of and in itself of guaranteeing the absolute integrity and transparency of political activity.